This is a BMW M2, fun, fast, affordable, and also one of the most respected M cars of recent times as well. Now if you're looking to buy one, stop right there. Watch this video to find out all the common problems, and I'll also show you what you need to check when you go look at a used example. Let's go. So in 2016, the M2 launched with the N55 engine. Now this was already a much loved engine by BMW fans, however it was also given a bit of a freshen up with parts from both the M3 and the M4 being added internally. So what goes wrong with this punchy little 365 brake horsepower engine? Well, thankfully nothing too serious. Coolant line splitting can be quite common, so we want to be sure to check for any coolant leaks underneath the car when we arrive. Also important to do that check again, just in case a savvy seller is trying to pull a fast one and has mopped up any mess underneath. Now another thing that can go wrong is these cars use a rather unusual electric coolant pump as well. And as I say, that can be known to go wrong, so we want to keep an eye on the temperatures when we go out on that test drive, but I'll remind you of that a little bit later when we get to it. So something else on the N55 engine that could go bad was the coils, unfortunately. So that's something we want to look for. We want to make sure when the car's sat still, idling, it's silky smooth, no lumpy idles here. And also when we get out on that test drive a little later, we want to make sure that power delivery is lovely and seamless and smooth. Now something else that could plague these engines a little was oil leaks. Now thankfully, if it is leaking oil, it's likely coming from one of three places. Either the oil filter housing is leaking, the sump is seeping or leaking, or it's the valve covers. So in 2018, the beloved N55 was moved out of the M2's engine bay to make way for the S55 engine, which was termed as the competition. Now this S55 engine, interestingly, also shares some of these same leak problems, so be sure to double check on that. Now there is one problem over and above that the S55 engine seems to report, but honestly I think it's a little bit overblown. It's not so much a common issue, I'm just going to mention it so you know I'm not omitting anything out of this guide, and that is a spun crank hub. Now again, as I say, it's not that common. Specialists who I know personally do say they reckon less than 2 or 3% of cars made actually have this problem, so really it's not one you need to worry about. But if you do see it mentioned, that's what it is. Hello! If you're enjoying this video and getting value from it, can I please ask that you give it a like? It really means a lot to us. Also, we're dedicated to becoming the largest, most accurate buyer's guide channel on YouTube, so it might be worth a subscribe for you as well. So onto the interior we go. Now we're not quite ready for that test drive yet. There's a couple of things we need to check. First up, rather ironically, is the indicators. The indicators can sometimes have problems. Now BMW drivers in the UK have a certain reputation of maybe not using their indicators that often, so it's a kind of humorous one. But yes, double check the indicators all work correctly, don't have a mind of their own. And also, check the horn. Need the ignition on for that one. So something else you need to check is the iDRIVE system. Now this could be a tricky one because if it's not a cold day, we're not really going to be able to test it, but some of these systems could go a bit haywire in colder weather. It would cycle radio stations, it would pump the volume, it would phone your mum when you're not asking it to. Something else you need to check when you're sat in here before we get going is the sound system. So the amps could start to go wrong on these and it would start to make a horrible screeching sound through the stereo. Now be careful with that because it can sometimes start quite subtly and get gradually worse and worse. Also check the external temperature gauge because they can go a bit haywire as well. Certainly if it's reporting 20 degrees in Scotland, you know it's a goner. Now we're almost ready for that moment you've been waiting for, hitting the road and getting this thing on a test drive. But last couple of checks that we need to do. One of them, rear lights. Make sure there's no moisture in there. That can be quite common. And finally, hopefully the seller has left the car cold for you so you can see it do a full-on cold start. Now when it does cold start, if it's got one of these M Performance rear back boxes on it, it might rattle. Now that might sound a bit unusual, but if it rattles for 10-15 seconds on that initial cold start, totally normal, nothing to worry about, but it should settle down and not be rattling afterwards. Alright, so on to that moment that I'm sure you've been waiting for, getting behind the wheel and getting your test drive. Now the first thing to note is the gearbox obviously in the car that you're looking at. Now whether it's going to be the 6-speed manual or if it's going to be the 7-speed dual clutch box, thankfully there's no massive horror stories when it comes to these. They're both really good. With the manuals however, you do want to watch the clutch. Now it's not so much that the clutch is going to slip, but rather what happens is heat spots can gather on that friction plate and the flywheel, and it can make a sort of stuttering feeling as you let off of that clutch and as you change gear. So double check that's not the case. Now when it comes to these dual clutch gearboxes, certainly in the earlier cars, like this one is, sorry about the bump, it's quite a firm car, we'll come to that in a moment. Yes, these dual clutch gearboxes, some of the earlier ones could be a little stuttery as you pulled away as well. Now that's not a problem as such, it's more just a quirk of the earlier gearbox that you'll find in M2s. Now the moment you've really been waiting for, let's make sure that engine's nice and responsive. Yep, this one is. Now obviously the camera's bouncing about here a little bit, we don't have a windscreen mount unfortunately, but again it is telltale of what this car's like. It's quite raw in feel. I'm sure you can hear the exhaust tone and also see just how firm this chassis is. Now again, something like a 240, bit more supple on the road, this is a bit more track orientated I would say, but again it just comes down to what you want out of the car. Now something else worth noting at this stage, this is something we already mentioned at the beginning of the video, but let me remind you, keep an eye on the temperatures that the car's reaching. Again, those electronic coolant pumps, a little bit unusual in setup and can go wrong. So if you're seeing that temperature rise, again, that could be an intermittent fault or a complete failure, hopefully not, with the coolant pump. And here's something else you can do. I'm going to pull over and talk about this one. Now, a real benefit to these modern systems is they do have onboard checks, so things like the brake fluid, the engine oil, various vehicle checks and brake pads even can be measured on this system. So be sure to use the iDrive, have a look at this and make sure you get a full list of OKs just like this car. Now if you're not, again that's something you can bring up with the seller, keep a bit of money in your pocket. And there we go, just like that, you've got all the checks you need to go out and find yourself a brilliant BMW M2. If you've got any questions, drop them below and we'll come back and help you out. Good luck finding your perfect M2, but for us, we're off to have some fun.